If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thank you for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, but not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a coloured poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made it to the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up. Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. That, of course, is the opening of George Orwell's novel 1984, published in 1949. However, the novel's original title was The Last Man in Europe. Orwell, for whatever reasons, changed the title to 1984 in 1948, which was a reversal of the last 2 digits of the year that he wrote the novel. I would say that a change in title came from Orwell's own desire to create a title that would be more memorable and more impactful, given the novel's bleak themes. The novel's famous opening line, "It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13, sets the tone for a bleak and very oppressive world that the novel actually depicts. And this line immediately establishes the novel's dystopian setting and foreshadows the themes of government control and manipulation. And universally acknowledged as one of the most celebrated openings of an English novel ever. And thinking about great novels, I guess that would differentiate 1984 from, say, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice or A Tale of Two Cities, is that it's had an incredible political resonance as well through the ages. Well, actually, A Tale of Two Cities has quite a political resonance too, but I think 1984, along with Animal Farm, they have to be the defining books of the 20th century. And I suppose you could say of our time, because even if you've never read Animal Farm or 1984, you're familiar with the concept, with the idea of thought crime, of Big Brother. And George Orwell, of all 20th century writers, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he is probably the one that has had the biggest impact on our political consciousness. And when I say our, I mean he has this global reputation, right? The word Orwellian is something that would be understood in China or Russia or Mongolia, as well as in the West. But he's also very, very distinctly English and a very, very distinctly English writer. And if you discuss English writers, Orwell's name will always come up. I personally think people should read Orwell because his works, they offer timeless and powerful insights into the dangers of totalitarianism and the manipulation of the truth and the loss of individual freedoms. Orwell's ability to craft compelling narratives that blend political commentary with human emotion makes his writing both thought-provoking and incredibly deeply engaging. His exploration of themes like surveillance, propaganda, and the corruption of power remain highly relevant in today's world, and it encourages readers to critically examine their own societies and the forces that shape them. This is a good thing. Reading Orwell not only enriches one's understanding of literature, but also fosters a greater awareness of the importance of safeguarding democratic principles and human rights. I just finished a book by Professor Robert Coles. who's Professor Emeritus at De Montfort University in Leicester. And I have to say that it's one of the best books that I've ever read about Orwell. And it's titled George Orwell, English Rebel. And it's an absolutely brilliant study of Orwell as a writer of Englishness and a progenitor of Englishness. You must read it. Well, I mean, you don't must read it. I'm not Big Brother telling you that you must read it, but it's a very good read. If you like Orwell and you like to find out more about Orwell in depth, it's the best book that I've read. So who was George Orwell? He was born in India. He was born in Bengal, in Matahari in 1903. And he's born at the imperial high noon of the Raj. And he's born into a very imperial family. His mother is French. Her family were teak exporters out of Burma, and they were called Limasan. So his mother was a French imperialist, and his father was Deputy Sub-Commissioner, 6th grade in the opium trade, which is the British rank for people dealing in the opium trade if you're dealing with China. And of course, on his parental side down the line, they were West Indian planters. So between the teak and the opium and the sugar, he's absolutely born into an imperial family. But he doesn't stay in India very long. He moves back to England when he's about 1 or 2. And he's moved out because there's a plague in Bengal at the time. And his mother takes him and his eldest sister Marjorie home. And they come to Henley-on-Thames in the Thames Valley, which he later came to call the Golden Country. He came to Henley-on-Thames in 1904, and he lived there with his mother and his sister. His father actually remained in India and remained in the imperial service. But the thing about him that is really interesting is his class position. And Orwell was a brilliant writer about class. And he had this wonderful formula. He said about his family, we were part of the lower upper middle class, which... for overseas listeners, you're probably going to find that absolutely weird, but it's the most English thing that you can possibly say. But basically, to cut a long story short, it's a family with expectations and with a certain sense of respectability and all of that, but without the money to really uphold it. And when he says upper middle, he means the cultural ambience and tradition of the family. There's 1 or 2 oil paintings in the attic of family members. There's a set of leather books. There's the compulsory cutlery, with the family crest on it. But when he says lower, that is upper lower. And what that actually means is that they've got no money. There actually used to be a thing called the Society for Distressed Gentlefolk, gentry effectively that have run out of money. And the phrase lower, upper, middle class points to, I suppose, old, expensive clothes that are fraying. But he does go to Eton. So he has the culture. He's got the upper bit. He goes to prep school. He's extremely clever. His family are serious people, and they talk about serious things concerning the country. So he's a natural, scholarly kind of boy. And just to explain to my overseas listeners, Eton is considered a public school. In the UK, a public school is a type of fee-charging private school originally for older boys. They are public in the sense of being open to pupils irrespective of locality, denomination, or parental trade or profession. But you have to have money to send your kids there, or your kids have to win a scholarship. Brighton College, just to give you another example, is the most expensive public school in the United Kingdom now. And they have annual fees, and this is after tax money, of £76,000. Eton, by comparison, charges £56,000 per annum and boasts an incredibly colourful alumni that includes guys like Eddie Redmayne, Tom Hiddleston, Ian Fleming, David Cameron, Prince William, Bear Grylls, who else? John Maynard Keynes. So it's a school with class. Orwell goes to Eton on a scholarship, and we should never underestimate his intellectual ability. So he goes to Eton on a scholarship, and he's what they call a colleger and not an Opidian. And that's how he gets there. He's got a lot of brains, he's got a lot of style, good traditions, but absolutely no money. And he's a King's Scholar, which is something very bloody special. And these guys live in college, which is their own special house for the scholarship boys at Eton. The Eden thing is really interesting because Orwell is one of the great writers of our time. I went to a private school myself, and I know the traditions of these schools, and I'm actually obsessed by them. I think they're so incredibly interesting, and I have mentioned them in a few podcasts. And it's interesting also for people who have never been to one of them because you don't know what goes on there. But they're incredibly formative. And Orwell is one of the great writers about school stories. And he very famously wrote this essay about Billy Bunter, who's very much a friend of Rearview Mirror Chronicles. Thank you, Billy Bunter. And well, to be fair, a friend of mine. I grew up reading Billy Bunter comics when I was at school. Well, anyway, Orwell's really interesting with his relationship with Eton because the school are obviously very proud of him. He writes very damningly about the world of public schools as he gets older and all this stuff. And yet, when he left, he went to Old Etonian dinners forever. You know, he actually hung around with Old Etonian friends. I mean, right to the end of his life, the Old Etonians were the people who clustered around him. And that sort of goes to one of the contradictions of Orwell, is that he's both of the kind of British establishment, but also stands outside it and criticizes it. So what's actually going on there? Well, Orwell is full of contradictions. I mean, we all are, but Orwell rather reveled in them. For him, Eton was never oppressive. I mean, he's against it, like he's against the Soviet Union. It's a massive thing that he's politically and morally against. And when you start plumbing all those actual feelings and emotions, then Eton isn't actually the enemy. It's not his problem. As a colleger, he was allowed all kinds of freedoms and liberties to be who he wanted to be. And he was clearly known as a bit of a character there, a kind of mad geek, if you like, a guy who could actually shock you, but then appall you, but then also make you laugh. So I think he was not unhappy at Eton, where he had the freedom to do all of that. So he doesn't get bullied by the toffs for being upper, lower, whatever. He doesn't talk about that at all. There are photographs of him actually playing rugby, and he's actually quite a big lad. He's got these incredibly big shoulders, you know, in these photographs. And of course, this is all before he contracts TB. He's a big, strong guy, and he's a character. And, you know, people who have got that kind of halo or character around them, they tend to survive in institutions like Eton. The school that he hated, the school which was a fascist institution, according to him, was his prep school. For overseas listeners, prep schools were originally developed in England and Wales in the early 19th century as boarding schools to prepare boys for leading public schools such as Eton College. And they're a completely different kind of place. They're usually run by private, money-grubbing, horrible people who hammer the kids to win the scholarships. Eton was very different for Orwell. His academic record at Eton was a bit mixed because he actually spends a lot of time playing games and being a character and writing, the school newspaper and so on. His family don't think he can actually win a scholarship to university, and of course they can't afford to send him to one. So what he does after Eton is, like many people who were in the same boat, he goes for the imperial police in Burma. And that's, again, Orwell. He's one of these great writers who wrestles with the kind of, the inequities of, contradictions of empire. And yet here he is in his late teens, voluntarily choosing to join the imperial police. So again, it's a family that pressures, and there is something in him that actually quite likes at that stage the idea of empire and the idea of the East and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think we've got our finger on him pretty early, and there's a big argument about why he didn't go to university. I mean, all his contemporaries did. His girlfriend at the time said that he wanted to go, but the parents couldn't afford it. Well, maybe, but I think Orwell just did what he wanted to do. If he fancied going to Spain to fight, off he went. If he wanted to go to Wigan, he went to Wigan. If he wanted to live in a bedsit, he lived in a bedsit. He just did it. And there's no sign of his politics at Eton either. So I don't think he's going to be anti-imperialist. He wrote a couple of really bad poems in favor of the war. And he's only a schoolboy, of course. Mind you, having said that, he's already writing pretty amusing things for the Election Times, which is Eton's newspaper. Pretty good. And they're actually pretty funny as well. So he's talented, and of course, he has an imperial tradition in the family. I think the prospect of university might have actually looked pretty boring to him, actually, compared to, going to Burma. I mean, think about it, guys. Burma, the East, sex, Orientalism, and all of that. I think he actually might have really wanted to go to experience it. I then wondered if it was perhaps then a kind of strain of perversity, that Eton fosters. And so, if you become famous as a character at school and you're a character because you're kind of, perverse, because you do things that are the opposite of what everyone else does, perhaps that then sets you on a groove that has you sticking in that groove for the rest of your life. You're always going against tradition. And then perhaps if everyone else is going to university, then you don't go to university and you go off and join the police or something. It's a marker of how different you are. I mean, I went to public school, and I think what actually happens is when you go to these type total institutions, it's a lot easier. You certainly find it easier if you're a known persona. And I think he found that at public school. And I think he was seeking to find it too in the empire, as well as all the romance and excitement that the empire offers at that particular time. So just before we leave Eton, Orwell was actually taught by Aldous Huxley. And isn't that amazing? Given that they are actually two great dystopian prophets of the 20th century, that is the most amazing coincidence, isn't it? And I often wonder, what they thought of each other. And the only exchange that I could find was a very small one between them in the classroom. I think Huxley was actually teaching Orwell French, and I don't think that he was a particularly good teacher. And Orwell would have been the kind of kid who would let you know about that too. But there's nothing in the research that I've found that says that they liked each other or they hated each other or even that they shared each other's views. Such a shame. Two great minds. So there's a glamour about the empire that's also conveyed through schoolboy comics at exactly this age. And that's exactly the kind of subject that Orwell will subsequently write essays about. But when he goes out to Burma, famously, he ends up having to shoot an elephant, and he writes about it. And then I wondered, to what extent is that the way he writes about that and the actual reflection of what happened? Or is it self-mythologizing? Because there is an argument about that essay. Did he really shoot an elephant, or is it the complete metaphor for the British Empire, that the British Empire is a dying elephant, or is it a bit of each? It's really hard to tell. And Orwell actually never says. Like so much of Orwell, I think he's way better at essays than he is at novels. And if you've never read Shooting an Elephant, it's a stunning, stunning essay in a way, because it shows how a young policeman like him and how the empire bullies him rather than he bullies the empire. And what you get is, that he doesn't want to shoot the elephant. He doesn't know how to shoot the elephant. He has to send for the gun to shoot the elephant. But when he takes aim at the elephant, and by the way, an elephant in Burma at this particular time is a very expensive piece of capital, the crowd want him to shoot the elephant. So he has to act like the white man has to act. He has to be brave and fearless and take the elephant down, although he doesn't want to do any of these things. So the point that he's making is that the imperialist wears a mask, and it's not really him. It's the things, the subject people expect him to be, that he's the prisoner of their expectations. He's their prisoner rather than they're his prisoner. And there are about 2,000 of them, of course, compared to him on his own. And he's only about 22 or something. So it's a great essay in that sense. I read that essay when I was in my early 20s, and I clearly remember being visibly moved by it. But I've actually seen students crying while reading that essay. It's that good. The death of an elephant is very, very moving. It's powerful stuff. And he actually describes what the elephant feels to be shot and to die on its knees. And it's exactly the same description he attaches to his own when he himself is shot in Spain through the neck. He gives himself the same sensations as the elephant. Really stunning writing. Very, very good writing. And this is where Orwell is really getting into the groove as an essayist of great stature. So he's there 4 or 5 years, and, it produces this famous essay, Shooting the Elephant, but he also produces another essay called Hanging. as he has to hang somebody while he's there. You know, he's part of this little posse that leads this guy out and hangs him in front of just a few policemen and officers in a prison yard. He comes back from Burma in 1927. I mean, he's 24 years old. He's only 24, and already he's lived 2 lifetimes, Eton College and Burma. And he discloses to his parents that he wants to be a writer. I mean, can you just imagine the look on their faces? So he comes back to England, and I then wondered what was wrong with his name, because obviously his real name was Eric Arthur Blair. Because it's when he comes back to England, isn't it, that he then starts to adopt the pseudonym of George Orwell. You know, he adopts it around 1932, and it becomes very natural for him. You know, he ends up signing himself with, George. His wife ends up calling him George. But why? Well, we don't know really, because he never says. Is it because St. George is the patron saint of England? Well, you can do that. You can say that a cigar signifies something else. But there's also the River Orwell, and that's in Suffolk. And of course, his parents are in Suffolk. He was a great naturalist, and he loved the countryside. And this river, the River Orwell, is a broad, slow-moving river. It's a very nice image. Some people say that he wasn't very keen on the Scots, and therefore he didn't like the name Blair. Anyway, he dropped it, and he went on using both names for a time, Eric Blair and George Orwell, without much thought, really. He just used them interchangeably. And then he sort of drifts around. I mean, if you look at him, it's quite a long period after he comes back from Burma when he's tutoring and teaching and writing. And when you're young, you're impatient and you can feel time slipping away. And actually, he writes 3 novels in the 1930s, 3 very unmemorable novels. They're not his best work, and they're not much read now. I mean, some people love them. I mean, if you're a complete Orwell fan, you probably would, but they're not very good. But arguably, the book that then makes him is The Road to Wigan Pier. It's a fabulous book. He writes that in 1936. Britain is in the grip of the Depression, and Orwell goes north and he writes. I mean, it's been done already. J.B. Priestley had done it. He wrote An English Journey a few years earlier. But what is it about that book? I mean, the funny thing is, I could never get a handle on the fact that the first half of that book was all about trudging around mines and sort of working people's houses and saying how, simultaneously poor they were, but also how cozy and authentic they were. And then in the second half, it's like an attack on the middle-class socialists. I mean, what the hell? It's such a compelling book. I can never decide whether Orwell has a genuine empathy, with the working classes, or whether he saw them as interesting specimens. And I think he's actually thrashing around for something to believe in. He said he's a natural contrarian, and I think it was Martin Amis who actually called him an auto-contrarian. And that's somebody who gets off by arguing with themselves. He's always taking his own temperature, so he's a man arguing endlessly with himself as well as the establishment. But the point is, he's looking for something to believe in. And when he hits the north of England, when he lives with the working class people, I mean, I know that makes them sound like kind of zoo animals, but he'd never seen them before. When he does that, he finds a part of England and a group of English people that he can actually believe in. And I don't think he's ever found that before. It's nothing new. I mean, in the 1930s, to be honest, you could hardly get on a train from London going north because there were so many middle-class boys going north to write about how awful it was, but also how authentic it was. And Orwell absolutely falls for that. But the truth is that it's here that he finds an England to believe in. It's not the England of the Raj. It's not the England of Eton. It's not even the England of down and outs in Paris and London. This is a group of people, a class, if you will, who he cannot possibly join. He can't do what they do. So why does he go to Wigan? Well, he's not there to do any work. So they're valuable in a way that he's not valuable. They count in a way that he doesn't count. So the first half of the Road to Wigan Pier tells you how valuable they are. The second part really is telling you how useless he is. It's like him looking in the mirror and saying, I'm a middle class socialist. What on earth can we possibly do? Middle class socialists, according to Orwell, may speak for the workers. They may go in search of the workers. They may praise the workers, but secretly, they dislike the workers for being working class, just as they dislike themselves for being middle class. And that's the key. So there's all kinds of things to unpack there because, of course, it's in that book that Orwell has this passage where he says, and it's the first time anyone actually articulates it, he says, the working classes smell. He said, we were always told, as middle class people that the working classes smell. And they do smell. There is a distinctive smell to them. They smell of sweat and dirt and all this kind of thing. And even now, this day and age, people are actually shocked when they read that, I think. So there is an extent, isn't there, that which he's seeing working class people as kind of specimens, but also, do you think there's also a self-hatred, a genuine self-hatred, or is it to sort of use the jargon, is it performative? Is it put on for literary effect? It's an interesting question, but when I think about it, I don't think it's real self-hatred. He says somewhere in argument, I remember it, that to disembourgeois himself was to cease to be middle class. And to cease to be middle class would be to kill himself. And what sensible person would ever want to do that? I mean, he's got to live with himself. They were writers at the time who said, you have to atone for your class background and really hollow yourself out and start again. This is terrible news to Orwell. He's not going to do that, and the road to Wigan Pier says, I am who I am. But at the same time, he does see these people, these amazingly valuable people in his eyes. He's never seen people like that before. He's never even been to the north of England before. You might say he's never breathed in and smelt the air up there, and now he has, and he thinks it's interesting, and he believes it's valuable. So yes, they are specimens in one sense, and he doesn't see all of their lives. And I think that's really interesting. He tends to just see the downside of the lives. The good side of the lives, I think he rather misses. I mean, he's in Wigan, and if you're in Wigan, the first thing you do is go and see a rugby match, but he doesn't do that. Then he goes to Barnsley, but he doesn't go and see a football match. But nevertheless, he's a fair person and he's trying to do with fair questions. He goes to the north thinking that the unemployed are the problem and socialism is the answer. And I think what happens is he actually comes back from the north thinking that the unemployed are the answer and that socialism is actually the problem. But this thing about socialism being the problem, I mean, he has these absolutely, these famous lines that socialism and left-wing ideas tend to attract, every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, and sex maniac in England. And that really offended. It actually still offends people, actually. Very short of academic-y people weep and wail and kind of rent their garments in misery, when he says these things, because they say that Orwell's, a dreadful man, sneering and high-minded. But he isn't. I mean, to be fair, Orwell actually said terribly politically incorrect things about gay people, about Jews, about all kinds of people. But he actually remains a kind of sainted figure across the political spectrum. And then I was wondering if Orwell is uncancelable, or do you think there are such high-minded people who shudder at the very mention of his name? My conclusion is I think everybody gets the Orwell they deserve. And it's not difficult to be shocked and surprised by him. But on the other hand, whenever a journalist is looking for a bit of moral firepower, bang, Orwell's name is mentioned. Just on the topic of where Orwell stood politically, ultimately, he is not responding to any political opinions. He's responding to the kind of gut instincts within himself. But would that be fair? I then wondered if it were true that Orwell was a conservative in feeling and in racial politics. And I think in his soul, he was not revolutionary. He did not want to abolish the past. He loved the past because it's where his world and our world was made, for better or for worse. But at the same time, he was anti-establishment in a way that he had been at Eton. He couldn't resist pot-shotting at the mighty, the vain, the venal. He loved history. He loved tradition. When he writes about public schools, he actually writes with love. But his politics are his rational universe, and he potshots at public schools, rich people, corporations, and so on. I mean, I don't think it's unlike a lot of us. We have the things we love and know best, and we don't want them changed, but we know there are things that need changing. And the question is, how do we avoid changing ourselves by changing the world around us? And maybe in that, he really does speak for a very, very important strain within England, certainly perhaps Britain. And perhaps that's why he has such significant status even now. But that word England is central, isn't it? And I think you can talk about Orwellian Englishness, and he's really one of the first writers in the 20th century to really grapple with the idea of England and an Englishness having a distinctive kind of cultural and political meaning. That it's all about, the concrete and the little things. And, that famous Jason Cowley, the saying, the grass is greener, the beer is bitterer, the ugly faces are uglier, the money, all of that stuff. I mean, in those days when he was writing, people definitely equated England with Britain. And it's all about England and Englishness rather than Britain and Britishness, isn't it? He's the first writer to write unashamedly about England, which is something you cannot do now. And it was actually difficult to do back then because England was supposed to carry the weight of the United Kingdom. And England was big and rich and powerful. And if England rolled over in bed, it could squeeze you or squash you or roll you out. So England has to sleep peacefully. Nowadays, it's rather different. It's difficult to be unashamedly English because England stands for all kinds of inequities and impressions and imperialisms that some of us are not particularly happy about. But he was different. He was a Republican at heart. And that's why he's a great essayist. The essay is the great instrument of the Republic, and he writes and speaks and feels freely about being English. In this day and age, I actually find that rather liberating, but it's not in the capital P, the political way. He starts with the details, he starts with the little things, and he also tries to get things right. If we are conservative in one sense and radical in another, then he deals with that, or at least he tries to. Orwell was Republican at heart, and of course he goes out to Spain to fight for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. And I think we should take a break there, but when we come back, perhaps we can talk about that and then about the impact of the Second World War, as well as, and look at Animal Farm and 1984. Very exciting. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So where were we? Orwell is just about to go off to Spain, and in December 1936, he joins POEM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista. So he joins a Trotskyite organization, and I hope everybody enjoyed my Spanish. Anyway, I mean, what he's doing, because, obviously a lot of people are going out to fight in Spain, and he's actually trying to prove something to himself. Or is he? Or is he genuinely motivated by ideological fervor? What's actually going on? Well, the first thing that's going on is that he's leaving his wife of only 6 months. And I must give Eileen O'Shaughnessy a mention because he marries her in June 1936. So he's married 6 months, they're living in a little cottage, and off he goes. He just wants to go, so he goes. Why he goes is a bit more tricky. He says he wants to kill fascists. But it might be that he also wants to write. It may also be that he wants to do what he's really itching to do. That is being an active correspondent. I mean, all his instincts are about the detail, about being there. He wants to be there. So first of all, he goes to Paris and he spends a bit of time with Henry Miller. And then he takes the train across France with other like-minded souls volunteering for the revolution, traveling to Spain. And as the train enters Spain, the peasants stand up in the fields and straighten their backs, and they put their right fist out, the sign for the soldiers going north on the train. And he absolutely loves this. It almost cements in his mind that he's doing the right thing. So he arrives in Barcelona. He finds what he thinks is a socialist or maybe a socialist anarchist society, but it's at least a free one. And he can't believe how wonderful things seem. And he joins this militia group through the offices of the Independent Labour Party, where he has connections. And then it all goes wrong quite quickly, doesn't it? Because he's only been there a few months when the Republicans are kind of torn apart by in-house faction fighting, basically because the Republican cause is becoming increasingly dependent on Stalin and the Soviet Union supplying them with weapons. So the communists turn on Poem. And I get the impression, and maybe this is more me misleading it, that it's a massive moment in Orwell's life. The sense of betrayal by the communists, because, of course, he then becomes famous as one of the most British anti-communist writers. So I think this is a seminal moment in his life. And then in May 1937, while fighting at the front, he gets shot through the neck. However, he had enormous luck. The bullet went through a tiny space of about, 1 centimeter between the carotid artery and his larynx, with impact bruising his vocal cords. A bit to the left or slightly to the right, or more tumble, in the high velocity bullet as it hit him, he would have died there and then. But because the shot hit him at an angle, the bullet actually passed out through the back of his neck without severing his spine, even though it apparently did graze a nerve, and which caused, temporary kind of paralysis in his arm. But that was it. He was incredibly lucky. So Spain, I think, is massive for Orwell. It's a defining experience. And this sets the tone for the rest of his life with his feelings for the communists. He sees blood there, and some of it's his own, and he is wrecked, really. I mean, his health is seriously wrecked there. And I think so are his little green shoots of socialism or even Marxism that might have been sprouting a little bit in Wigan. Because what he sees is a republic dominated by the Soviet Union, who are the only foreign power supplying the republic with tanks and weapons, but they want to dominate them. But far from the Soviet Union being too kind of revolutionary for Orwell, it's not revolutionary enough. He thinks it's suppressing the revolution, whereas it should be unleashing it. But the real problem he has is not with the Soviet Union, which is something of an abstraction, and where Orwell, is standing on the front line. His real problem is with the people on the left in England who are pro-Soviet. And that's where his anger and his sense of revenge really comes about. So when he gets back to England, importantly, he goes into a writing frenzy against the left, the soft left and the hard left. And of course, out of that frenzy comes Homage to Catalonia, which I think he always regarded as his greatest book. And when he comes back, he talks about, the deep sleep of England, doesn't he? From which it will only be woken by bombs. So presumably in saying that, he has a sense that war will be coming to Britain, the Second World War. And his attitude to Britain at the time is that the Second World War, when it breaks out, it's going to be interesting because there's an element of hatred there, of hostility there, of dislike for it. Politically, he is really confused at this period in time. And we're talking about 1937 to 1939. And I think what he does is he takes the Poem position on spin and just applies it wholesale. He slaps it on Britain and Germany. He basically says, unless you fight Germany and revolt against the ruling class in Britain, you can't win the war. He calls it blood in the Ritz. He actually has visions of London in 1940 of the English fighting each other while they are fighting the Germans who are trying to kill them. It's a completely messed up, trashy, Marxist tactical position, if truth be told. And he can't really deal with it. It doesn't go anywhere. And at one point, he's actually very anti-war. He lines up with the Independent Labour Party in the Peace Pledge Union, with their pacifism or a form of pacifism. And the thing about England and the English is that he gets himself straight at some point. And in 1939, with the declaration of war, he actually sees that the British people are up for it. He didn't think they would be, but they are. There's no panic. There's no shock. There's no enthusiasm either, I might add. It's just getting on with it. In Churchill's words, it's just KBO. Keep buggering on. And he aligns with that. He thinks this is real, and he thinks it's necessary. Orwell then tries to join up as soon as war is declared. He puts himself forward for the army, but his health is wrecked by then, and he can't pass the fitness test. He tries to get an apprenticeship as a fitter and joiner at a factory, a machinist. He doesn't get that either. And in the interim, to earn money, he writes lots of reviews of theaters and cinema, and later he's actually deeply embarrassed about that. He then tries to join the intelligence corps. And of course, he gets absolutely nowhere because the intelligence corps have actually been watching him for years. So in the end, he moves to London in 1940 and he joins the local defence volunteers, which would later to become the Home Guard, where he actually rises through the ranks to sergeant. He loves the Home Guard, and it seems his platoon pretty much loves him. After all, he actually knows about street fighting. He's been shot in the throat in Spain and nearly killed. So, he's a useful man to have in your platoon. And keep in mind, guys, he has a paramilitary background. The police in Burma were not bobbies on the beat. They were doing some serious stuff. This was a paramilitary force. So he knew about that, and he knew about street fighting from Spain. And along with a guy called Tom Winteringham, who was a left-winger in 1939, 1940, he even thought that maybe the Home Guard could become a British militia and that it could have, maybe revolutionary instincts. After all, here you have the people who are actually armed. And although in one sense that's a real sign of the virtues of democracy, you can arm the people. On the other hand, Orwell seemed to think that it might be political. As late as the autumn of 1940, he's writing. And he writes, the London gutters will have to run with blood when the red militias are billeted at the Ritz. And it's not really until 1942 that he sheds himself of these thoughts, and he actually admits that he got it hopelessly wrong. But actually, the British people were miles ahead of him. Even Churchill was miles ahead of him. This was a war that had to be taken on, and it had to be fought to the finish. And I then wondered, well, when did he start working for, the Ministry of Truth, aka the BBC? And that was in 1941. But the Ministry of Truth wasn't actually modeled on the BBC, because I always thought that it was, but it actually wasn't. And I didn't find that out until I started doing this research. The Ministry of Truth was actually based on Senate House in London, which was never, ever the BBC. And he never actually worked at BBC headquarters either. He worked in Oxford Street, where they had actually rented their premises. He called the BBC a frightful bureaucracy. And it was his first introduction to bureaucracy after all. This was a guy who never held down a proper job, did he? But now he had one. But just going back to the politics, this great irony of the Second World War that Britain finds itself allied to the one power that Orwell really detests, Stalin's Soviet Union. So in 1943, he starts writing Animal Farm. And I think he's obviously thinking about Animal Farm as a warning, presumably to the British public. Orwell never ever talks about his writing plans. And I think that's really interesting as a writer myself. So he just appears at his agents with a written book. But in retrospect, he said that he thought of Animal Farm when he was in Warrington and he saw a little boy walking down a lane with a Shire horse, kind of whacking the horse. And he thought, what if that Shire horse just turned on the little boy and with one great hoof just put him down? So what is Animal Farm actually about? Well, I can tell you one thing. It's not just about the Soviet Union. I think it's about revolution and how it invariably leads to a vacuum. And the vacuum leads to another kind of ruling elite, which may well be worse than the one you replace. And I think it's a warning about revolutions in general, rather than just about the Soviet Union. When he was pressed on it, he's actually rather surprisingly mild about his intentions, regarding the Soviet Union. He says, well, the Soviet Union has its problems. They're not my problems directly. I don't really want to get involved with that. My real aim with Animal Farm is to warn the British that the Soviet Union is no model to look after, that we actually must find our own way, and we must stop looking to Russia because it's destroying the hope of real, genuine socialism here. And the fascinating thing about Animal Farm is that he struggles to get it published. So many British publishers say, we're actually in bed with the Russians. We don't want to publish it. So, for example, Victor Galantz, who worked with T.S. Eliot of Faber and Faber, says, it's a jolly good book, but we're not going to do it. He ends up doing it with Warburg. And then, of course, amazingly, the CIA take it up, or actually the OSS take it up, who later become the CIA, but they take it up. And get this, they actually drop copies by balloon into occupied Europe. And I guess the question really is it a right-wing book, do you think? I mean, that warning about revolution, that's a classic Edmund Burke thing, isn't it? The reaction in Britain, well, the reviews are great, except for, predictably, the Daily Worker. The communist reviews are not great. They're actually very cruel. And they say it's a disgraceful, treacherous work. But Orwell doesn't seem to care about that. Just going back to the publishers, because I mentioned that he had great trouble, getting it published, not just from the left publishers, but also from, right-wing publishers. What he discovered was that there were even communist agents advising publishers from the British Ministry of Information, advising them not to publish his book. And of course, later these guys turned out to be communist agents. And this really went rather deep with Orwell. He knew that communism was a bad idea, but now he actually knew that it infiltrated and it worked by deceit and deception. And of course, this had an amazing influence on 1984. I think it's a populist work, actually, if you really put my opinion about it. There are no left-wing intellectuals in Animal Farm. It's just the people, the animals who are good. Yes, and of course the pigs wind up, more equal and basically become humans. Actually, when you think about it, Old Major is a kind of intellectual. Is he a combination of Marx and Lenin? Maybe not Lenin, but certainly Marx. And of course, Old Major is actually a prize boar. Sorry, I'm laughing at my own joke. A prize, and it doesn't matter. Ignore the pun there. And he's actually exhibited as Willington Beauty. Animal Farm, of course, comes out just after the Attlee government has come to power and the end of the war. And Orwell then starts writing seriously 1984. And the opening of that book that I read at the beginning of this podcast, the hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. I've actually recorded an episode on Agatha Christie, which I'm going to release a little bit later, where I talk about her novels holding a mirror up to the era of the Attlee government. And there's a sense, isn't there, in which 1984 is actually a bit of a satire at the Attlee government as much as, as anything. And that kind of climate of austerity, of controls. Or am I being a little bit unfair there? 1984 is clearly London, but it's not quite London because the clock strikes 13 and Big Brother is there on a poster. And, and it's somewhere called Victory Square. I mean, the Brits would never call anything Victory Square. And Victory Square, it rings of some other kind of world. So it is London and it isn't London. And I started with this from 1984. And I think it's interesting that we're bringing this podcast kind of to an end with 1984 in a way that it's the final hurrah of Orwell's career. It's his last great work, but in its themes, it's also the last great work. All the things he has defended and advanced and actually teased into existence, like our law and our language and our literature and our moral sense in our trust in each other, what he's asking is what happens when all those things go. Orwell loved history. He loved tradition. But I mean, how important was that to him? And of course, Room 101 shows your deepest horror, your deepest nightmare. And in a sense, 1984 is his Room 101, because Winston Smith is rewriting the times. He is destroying the past. And then I wondered if that is the emotional core of the novel. Orwell is facing his worst nightmare with that. the idea that the past can be completely lost. And the Attlee government is a revolutionary government. I mean, he's not really interested in mainstream politics. He's not really interested in institutions, but he fights for Attlee right to the end, fair and foul, actually. And this is about what revolutions do in English socialism. It could be English fascism. It doesn't really matter. What happens if all things history is giving us, like say our law and our language, are reduced to nothing? What happens then? Where are we then? Interestingly, J.R.R. Tolkien, when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, has a similar theme, the eye in the sky, the big brother watching you, etc. And I'm going to cover him in a future podcast. But it's interesting that writers of this particular time were talking and thinking and writing about Big Brother. Orwell spent his life trying to listen to the people and the representations of the people, and now he finds the people so misrepresented by their law and their language and their history that they're extinct. There are no people now. But of course, the hope lies in the people. And you see that in his essay, The Lion and the Unicorn. This is almost mystical faith in the English masses. I mean, he is a populist, I think, but he's also an artist. And what he tries to do is conjure a people worth believing in through his art. This is not completely removed from how they are. It's just his art brings them into power and into focus. They are the angel in the marble. He has the marble. And the art makes him an angel. And look, we could argue about this forever, but if we live in a democracy, we have to represent somebody or something, which actually reminds me now of the Brexit debates, which were pretty strong. I mean, what is Parliament representing other than itself? It must be the people. But who are the people? Well, you have to show me that. And I think Orwell's great contribution was that he showed us the people as he saw them, unlike any other writer. And in 1984, what happens when all the things that make the people have been destroyed? What are you left with? You're left with an old man in a pub who wants half a wallop, and a lot of people who really don't know where they are except they're not in the elite. And that is where the hope lies. But it's not a great hope, dear listener. It's not. It's the hope that turns not to be no hope at all. And that ultimately is what you're left with, is no hope anywhere, which is actually a bit of a downer, really, isn't it? So 1984 is published in June 1949. The Cold War, and actually Orwell is actually credited with coining that phrase, the Cold War is on in earnest. Orwell is a sainted figure to lots of British writers, to British journalists, to politicians, and so on. But they are also his critics. And one of the things that Orwell's critics always seize on is in the spring of 1949, so just before 1984 is published, Orwell comprises this list for Celia Kerwin from the Information Research Department, which has really been set up by the Labour government. It's an anti-communist department. He's written down a list of 38 names, including Michael Foot, Charlie Chaplin, J.B. Priestley, and many, many others, and says they're all dodgy. You shouldn't get them to do any work for you. You can't rely on them as they're all communists. Now, look, some people are going to say that's fine, and some people will say that he's a hypocrite. I mean, he's just written 1984, which is all about Big Brother. And here he is informing on people, in effect becoming part of the thought police. Or am I being a little bit unfair there? But look, the thing with Orwell is that he loved lists. He loved making lists. He's always listing things. 38 things to do in the garden, 22 people who will go over to the Nazis if they win the war. He's always making lists. And Kerwin is an old girlfriend. She comes to see him when he's very, very sick, and he's not far from dying. I think she comes months before he dies and asks for the information, basically asking which people should the government not trust to write well about this country as communism is kind of taking control. And I actually think it's a fair question at the time. And I think Orwell thought it was a fair question too. The hard part of getting over this is that all through the war, Orwell is hugely influenced by a guy called James Burnham. And you may not have heard of him, but he was a massive figure in the 1940s, where he argued about big societies like Russia and America and Europe, converging. But Burnham, after the war, said it's not about a number of societies converging. It's just a straight fight. It's a straight stand-up fight between democracy and communism. And you have to decide what side you're on. You have to decide. And Orwell was definitely convinced by that. He reviewed Burnham and he said he was right. Now is the moment in the Cold War to decide. And of course, then ironically, in 1947, Truman introduces the executive order which screens federal employees for what kind of politics they hold. And of course, this is a precursor, of course, to the McCarthy trials that followed later. There is something about this list that tells us that Orwell went with Burnham and went with Burnham's position, that such as the methods of duplicity, deceit, infiltration, coming clean about your true intentions, that it has to be revealed. And that's what Orwell's doing with this list of 38 people to Celia Kerwin. The only problem with it that I see is that it's not transparent, it's secretive. And his whole point with 1984 was we've got to reveal the communists. We've got to show them for what they are. We can't be 1984. We've got to strip away their true allegiances, and we've got to put it out into the open. And of course, here he is, doing it quietly. Having said that, in his defense, he is in a sanatorium. He's seriously ill, and he's trying to do his best in defense of a Labour government, which he passionately supports. So he's got tuberculosis, and he dies in January 1950. He dies at a time when his reputation is growing and growing and growing. And as we said, at the start of this program, the word Orwellian comes to be one that everybody understands. It becomes an adjective to describe so much during the course of the Cold War and indeed afterwards. At the end of his life, George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair, was a figure marked by both physical frailty and unwavering intellectual vigor. He spent his final years in and out of sanatoriums where he continued to write with an urgency, I think fueled by his declining health. His final days were actually spent on the remote Scottish island of Jura, where he sought solace in the isolation and beauty of nature, something he loved so much. Yet, I don't think his mind ever strayed far from the political and social issues that had defined his literary career. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Bye for now.